Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Nikonov, and I'm here today with you on the Just Guns channel in the Moscow Firearms Museum. Recently, Royal Armouries uploaded their two-part video on the AN-94. Johnathan Ferguson did an outstanding job providing you with, in my opinion, the best video on the AN-94 there is. However, such a small two-part series of videos is something pretty limiting for such a huge topic. Therefore, I thought that while Jonathan gets into the details of the AN-94 itself, I can probably cover the topic in somewhat broader terms. To do so, I have to mention the fact that I'm going to refer a lot to the information originally provided by the AK Info project, led by Pavel Ptitsyn and Konstantin Podgornov. So where do we start at? In the 1975, the Soviet Ministry of Defense Industry starts a new program dedicated to finding a solution for the quote-unquote high-efficiency assault rifle. But what is a high-efficiency assault rifle? As we all know, by 1975 the main cartridge for the Soviet army was supposed to be the 545 by 39mm cartridge that was used with the AK-74 and which was previously known as a 5.6mm cartridge. This cartridge was the starting point for all the other attempts at increasing the efficiency of the assault rifle. The efficiency itself was, in the first place, determined as the probability of hit provided by the rifle. Probability of hit decreases as the distance to the target increases. It is becoming increasingly more difficult to choose the right aiming point and actually aim correctly. This is further exaggerated by the accuracy of the rifle decreasing over distance. All in all of this is called aiming errors in the Russian or at the time Soviet terminology. So how do you decrease those aiming errors? Well, there are multiple approaches to the issue. The Soviets were basically busy with all of those. The cartridge itself was being modernized, getting eventually from the 7.6 to 7.6M. However, that is something that mostly affects the probability of actually neutralizing the target upon hitting and not the probability of hit itself. Another route to go is to use some sort of a better aiming solution, for example, the low power optics. Such stuff allows for greater precision, which decreases the aiming errors, therefore improving the probability of hit overall. And there was plenty of such optics being developed in the late Soviet Union, including the 1P29 itself. But there is more than that. There is another way to approach this issue, and to understand this way, we should do some math. Let's say that the probability of missing the target with your first shot, and by shot I mean the decision to press the trigger and aiming towards the target, is X. Then probability of hitting the target with that first shot is 1 minus X. However, if your shot or press of the trigger led to more than one bullet flying towards the target, this equation differs. Your probability of hit with at least one bullet now becomes 1 minus X multiplied by Y, with Y meaning the probability of miss with all the other following rounds. What does this equation tell us? Two things actually. First, your overall probability of hit increases if you shoot more than one bullet at a time. Second, if your probability of missing the target with all the following bullets is approaching 1, meaning that all of those are pretty much never going to hit the target, you get no difference in terms of performance if compared to shooting one bullet only. This means that it does make sense to use the burst instead of a single shot, but only under certain conditions. If your muzzle climb between the shots is so high that the deviation between the mean point of impact of of your first bullet and the following ones is much greater than the aiming error, then it's pointless. Let's take a look at what this means in practical terms. To do so, let's compare an AK-74 or an AK-S74 in this case, firing single shots, 3-round bursts, and an RPK-74 shooting in 3-round bursts as well. Shooting in the most stable position, shooting prone, supported, a very great shooter hits a head-sized target with the first shot, whether that's an AK-74 firing in single shot, or an AK-74 firing in bursts, or the RPK-74 firing in bursts. This means that when your aiming error is not exceeding the target, you will hit it no matter what, and the burst does not increase your probability of hit. But at the top distance at which the AK-74 and the RPK-74 are supposed to be used in the Soviet doctrine, meaning 500 meters, the situation differs a lot. With an AK-74 firing in single shot, it would require 4 shots. With an AK-74 firing in bursts, it would only require 3 bursts. Basically meaning that it became 30% easier for the shooter to hit his target. And if we compare that to the RPK-74, we only get 2 bursts to do though. This is because the following shots in the burst compensate for the aiming errors. This is because their following shots compensate for the aiming errors, because their full auto accuracy is very comparable to their aiming errors and the size of the target. This is especially prominent in case of the RPK-74 because of its very heavy barrel, very long barrel, and outstanding stability when shooting prone and supported. At the same time, if those same shooters are going to use their guns in a run-and-gun manner, the situation changes dramatically. It would actually require them 3 shots from an AK-74, 3 bursts from an AK-74, and even 6 bursts from an RPK-74. This is because their full auto accuracy in this case is much worse than their aiming errors, and it is much worse than the size of the target. This is especially prominent in case of the RPK-74 because of its high weight and machine gun ergonomics. So what you want to have is some sort of an assault rifle that would perform as greatly in unsupported position as a normal rifle performs in a supported position. If you do so, each of your bursts is much more effective than a single shot. This conclusion is the result of different programs that were all started in the 1975, in which all sorts of solutions were tried. Notably by the 3rd Central Scientific Research Institute of the Ministry of Defense of the Soviet Union, it was concluded that in all normal, or 600 rounds per minute, average 1000 rounds per minute, and high 2000 rounds per minute cyclic rates, the most effective burst is the 2-round burst. At the same time, with all sorts of operating principles, it was always necessary to implement some sort of a higher cyclic rate into the design in order to allow for the required significant performance improvement, because otherwise the period in between shots was so high or so long that the rifle basically had too much time to move in between shots. Just to give you an idea of how broad these studies were, I have to tell you that Izhmash was working on heavy long-barreled assault rifles, sort of a hybrid between the AK-74 and the RPK-74. Izhmash was working on improved performance classical assault rifles, short recoil operated assault rifles, balanced recoil assault rifles, high cyclic rate assault rifles, delayed recoil assault rifles, and even SVD-based assault rifles. The results of all of those developments were studied at the Tochmash, possibly the main firearms research facility in the Soviet Union. On the basis of these programs, led by all sorts of facilities, from military centers and to research institutes, requirements for quote-unquote high-efficiency assault rifle were put together in 1977. The program, named Flažok, was rather short-living, with the conclusions being drawn quickly, resulting in the Abakan program being started in the 1979. The first stage of Abakan was huge. It included 20 rifles from 8 different manufacturers or design bureaus, but only 11 made it into the second stage. What I have to note now is the fact that the balanced recoil assault rifles were not nearly as great as some people think of them. For example, people often try to present the AEK 971 as some sort of a next best thing behind the AN-94. However, in fact, not a single balanced recoil assault rifle made it clearly into the final stage of the Abakan. In case of the AEK 971 specifically, I should probably quote Mr. Koksharov himself, who is the designer of the AEK 971. And according to him, by 1982, KMZ has just fixed the heavy charging issues they had since the early 1970s, approaching the normal A3 or AK-74 parameters. If you're not aware of what a balanced recoil operating rifle is, I can show you the SR1, a continuation of another series of balanced recoil assault rifles, this time coming from Izhmash and not the KMZ. This rifle is a continuation of the AL series by Mr. Alexandrov. I've intentionally removed the handguard so that you can see the balancing mechanism itself. As the bolt carrier reciprocates backwards, the balancier reciprocates forward, and vice versa. If the balancier and the bolt carrier with the bolt are balanced properly, and there is a proper kinematic connection between those, this counteracts the recoil generated by the bolt carrier. By 1984, there were 7 rifles left, including 2 featuring classical operating principles, 3 featuring a balanced recoil mechanism, and 2 featuring a delayed recoil mechanism. In 1986, it was decided that only 3 rifles are to be allowed into the final stage of the program, all of those featuring a delayed recoil mechanism. 2 rifles from the 1984 became 3 rifles in 1986 because one of the designs that was present in 1984 divided into 2 variants of it. The reason for that was it was decided that all of the other rifles have basically reached their full potential and they can't be modernized any further, meaning that they will never meet the requirements of the program. This conclusion is especially curious if we pay attention to the fact that Nikonov, that was conducting a program analyzing the progress and potential behind the Abakan, specifically noted in 1986 that there is a new rifle developed in the West that is being developed and trialed in the Western Germany and potentially the US, and this rifle was the HK G11. This G11 rifle was not only featuring the delayed recoil mechanism, but it was probably meeting the Abakan accuracy requirements, outperforming a conventional assault rifle by as much as 2 times. However, I have to mention the fact that later on, probably in 1987, it was decided that one more rifle is still to be allowed to the trials. Namely, it was the Korobov TKB 0111, albeit that was a facultative option only. So what do we have at the late stage of the Abakan? A Nikonov AS assault rifle featuring a delayed recoil mechanism and a reciprocating magazine, a Nikonov ASM assault rifle featuring a delayed recoil mechanism and a non-reciprocating magazine, a Stechkin TKB-0146 assault rifle featuring a delayed recoil mechanism and a non-reciprocating magazine, and as a facultative option, the TKB-0111 by Mr. Korobov. So what were the results by 1989? Well, first of all of the rifles featured a high cyclic rate of fire, laying in between 1900 rounds per minute and 2100 rounds per minute. All of the rifles were 1.5 to 2.5 times more effective than a normal AK or AKS-74. None of the rifles met the accuracy requirements, but they were quite close, I have to mention. Stechkin achieved the best results shooting prone, and Nikonov achieved the best results shooting prone unsupported and shooting in a standing position. At the same time, the difference between all of the rifles was not as significant as one may suggest it was. Shooting prone, the difference in accuracy was only 1 centimeter. Shooting prone unsupported, it was 5 centimeters. And shooting standing, it was 6 centimeters only. This means that in terms of accuracy, the results were pretty much equivalent in between all of the rifles. And this is especially notable because of the fact that the Korobov design was pretty much a classical conventional assault rifle, but overall it was ASM by Nikonov that was found to be the most reliable and durable. Upon firing 10,000 rounds, only one part was broken in the ASM, namely the firing pin. All in all, this meant that the ASM was the definitive winner of the Abakan program, reaching the operational assessment stage in the 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division near Moscow. But how did Nikonov get to this point? How does one come up with such a seemingly complicated design? Well, obviously not out of thin air, and it is actually quite easy to understand the AN-94 overall and its history as well if we just follow the steps the Nikonov was going. If we go back to the late 1970s, when all of these high-efficiency assault rifles were just starting to be developed, Nikonov presented a pretty much shooting mock-up or a demonstrator of the concept. It was a literal AK-74 mounted onto a lafette or a gun carriage. The AK-74 was spring-loaded, meaning that as it was fired, it slided backwards, reciprocating under recoil. And that is exactly what the delayed recoil mechanism is all about. Later on, Nikonov increases the firing rate, adds on the burst mode to control the increased firing rate, and pretty much brings the gun together. That is what an AS rifle is, basically. Think of the G11, it operates under a very similar principle, meaning that the actual gun, including the magazine, is sliding backwards in a body that is held by the shooter. But when your magazine is sticking out of the gun, unlike it is in case of the G11 where it is parallel to the barrel, it becomes an issue that the magazine reciprocates with each shot. Now, this leads to the introduction on the ASM an additional mechanism with the infamous cable and a disc plate necessary to fit the extra second round. And if you want to further exaggerate all the positive effects of the rifle, you just mount an optic onto it, just like the G11 has one. In fact, 10 out of 45 first ASMs that reached the 2nd Guards Motorized Division had an optic included into their issued kit. But it couldn't be all that great, right? Well, definitely. While ASM or AN-94 is in fact basically 2 times as effective as a conventional assault rifle, such as the AK-74 or M16A2, basically reaching the standards of the G11, original requirements for the program were much broader than that. Even though Abakan requirements were getting looser and looser over time, even in the last stage of the Abakan, it was required for the rifle to have no more than 20 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. It was required to withstand the drop test. It was required not to be heavier than an AK-74 and be easier to manufacture than one. On top of that, it was required to feature a high-capacity magazine, and ASM failed at all of those, among some other less significant ones. The reason for that was the fact that it was believed that probably all of those issues can be fixed during the serial production of the rifle. And all of those don't matter as much if you think about the fact that we actually got a rifle that is in fact so much more effective than a conventional one. To an extent, that was true. In fact, Izhmash developed a 6L31 magazine that was a 60-round quad-stack magazine usable with the AN-94. And if you think of it, the reliability of the rifle was increased over time as well, but that didn't matter much, because all in all, what killed the rifle was the horrendous economic crisis of the 1990s that absolutely killed all the chances of the rifle reaching mass production. In 1997, the price for the AN-94 was set by Izhmash to be $1,900, while a normal 100 series AK costed $200 only. In the modern prices, that's basically $3,800 for an AN-94 and $200 for an AK-74M. This price of the AN-94 was obviously way too high for the struggling Russian economy of the time. But what happened to the AN next? Well, it was brought back from the dead basically in circa 2013 or 2014 by the engineers of the military facility number 33491, also known as Rzhavka area, one of the biggest firearms trials facilities in the Russia and previously in the Soviet Union. The AN-94 was modernized by them pretty heavily. However, this development was an obvious dead end. If anything, that was just a demonstrator that could have been, at least theoretically, compared to the Retnik program rifles. But Retnik is a whole another story. So that's all for today. Thanks.